that's going to take the service Apache2 and start it. And it starts that up. So now if I do a netstat -antp, we have port 80 listening. Port 80 is the typical port for web servers, so that makes sense. Now we have 80 listening. Of course, we can stop it as well. Same way we can do Apache2 stop if we want to stop it. And while we're on the subject of networking, I wonder what my IP address is. By default, Kali will use DHCP, so it will automatically pull an IP address from your router. So if you're on host only, it'll pull it from VMware's host only network. If you're on bridged, it'll pull it from whatever router your computer is using. To get an IP address, it'll act as though it's a completely different machine. We can do ifconfig as opposed to ipconfig for Windows. Windows has to be different, but Mac and Linux and whatnot, I'll use ifconfig to look at networking information. So if you get that backwards from time to time, you're in good company, so no worries. So ifconfig, and that'll show us our networking information. So I have east 0, and I also have the local, so that's just going to be my loopback. So, home, you've probably seen the t-shirt, there's no place like 127.0.0.1, no place like home. Geeky joke. But we're more interested in our actual interface that talks to the internet. So my network is 192.168.1. Yours may be different. And I am .77. My net mask is 255.255.255.0. If you're unfamiliar with net masks, I may not be as familiar with them as I think I am, because I actually think I got that question wrong on my final exam in networking. But basically what it means is how many bits of the IP address belong to the network and how much are the actual host. So in this case, it says my first 3 octets are going to belong to the network. So 192.168.1 are all part of the network. So that means everything on this network is going to be 192.168.1, and then everything from .1, which is probably the router, all the way to 254, because 255 is the broadcast. So we actually see that here. So that's going to basically call out to everyone. So I have all those IP addresses, again, between probably 2, because 1's probably the router, and 254 that can be assigned. In this case, I'm 77. So this is a /24. So this would be 192.168.1.1/24. That's just another way of representing this net mask. So that's saying that 24 bits are going to be part of the network. So 8, 16, 24. So you could also say have a /16, so that would be 255.255.0.0, and then only 192 and 168 would be part of the network. So then we could have .1, .2, .3, all the way to .254, and then 1 through 254 on all those as well. So a bit more space. So again, certainly you can read networking books. It's basically anything that you can learn about computer science is ultimately going to help you in pen testing. I spent way too much time looking at things from computer science that I didn't pay attention to when I should have, thinking I would never need them. So it's definitely, if you do have a computer science background, it is worth it. And, if you want to spend your time reading networking manuals, it'll only help you in the long run. So you can also set a static IP address, because again, by default, it does use DHCP. So that is going to get it to grab an IP address each time, but then your IP address might change. So it probably won't from just day to day, but it might over time if you restart the VM enough. And certainly when you go to other locations, you'll get a new IP address. But we might not want that to happen. Like, for instance, if you're shooting a video for a class, you may want to have the same IP address all the time. So what I can do in Linux for that is I can do nano or vi /etc, so in the etc directory from root /network /interfaces. So So yours is going to look a little bit different from mine. You're actually not going to have this part. So you should have iFace, ETH0, iNet, and then DHCP, whereas mine says static. And then these 3 lines here you won't have. So that's just because yours is DHCP, and I set mine to static, so my IP addresses would always be the same, so my videos at least would be consistent. So let's just change DHCP to static, and then you can give it an address. So mine's 192.168.1.77. Whatever you get from DHCP, just give it something in that range. And netmask, again, yours will probably be 255.255.255.0 if you're at home. Maybe if you're at a work network or some other enterprise, it might be different. I mean, I see /8s and /16s all the time in enterprises, but it seems like most home networks are /24. Give it the gateway. It's probably .1. It's probably what your router's IP address is. Again, if you're at home, it could be anything in an enterprise. You know, IT people have to have something to keep themselves busy, like messing with the network. So you can do this or not do this. You don't have to, certainly. And we can do service, networking, restart. To restart that, I didn't make any changes, so I'll just leave it alone. And so that's just a little bit about networking. Again, probably a class on networking you could take or a book, but just a little bit, really. I mean, as long as you can talk to other systems, like if we did a ping, this is going to use ICMP echo, and it's going to talk to another system and see if it's alive. That said, a live system doesn't necessarily have to respond to ping. So just because it doesn't get anything back doesn't mean the system's not up. But say if I went after, I think 76 should be around, the system's alive. So I'm able to talk to another system on my network. Because I have internet access, because I'm using Bridge, I can also like ping www.google.com and talk to another system on the internet. So, again, it doesn't necessarily have to respond to ping. In fact, newer Windows systems who have Windows Firewall on actually don't by default. So just because it doesn't ping doesn't mean it's not there. We'll see that there are other ways we can see whether a system is up or not. So, I mean, as long as we're able to talk on the network, when we get on a network, we want to be able to talk to other systems if we're doing pen testing. So really just need to know enough networking to troubleshoot if you're not getting an IP address at your client location. So, I mean, that can be rather embarrassing if it's something really simple that you couldn't figure out. So, just a little bit of networking necessary. So, one last thing. We're going to look at a tool called Netcat, which is abbreviated as NC, Netcat. So, if we do a man NC, calls itself the TCP/IP Swiss Army knife. And in fact, you could say indeed it is. Netcat is really awesome at making TCP/IP connections. Again, Q to get out of the man page. So we have a lot of different things we can do with Netcat. We can listen on a port. So Netcat-L for listen. We can listen verbosely on port. How about 1, 2, 3, 4? So that's going to listen on a port for an incoming connection. So if I open up another terminal window, in this case I'm just working with 2 different terminals on the same system. I could do this between systems as well if you want to pull up your Ubuntu system, your target that you downloaded. That also has Netcat on it by default, so you could actually, with the IP addresses, work between the 2. So with this one, let's do a Netcat, and instead of going into listen mode with the -L, let's actively connect. So we actually have basically 2 ways of dealing with this. We'll see this more when we look more into pen testing, particularly in Metasploit. We'll see bind and reverse shells. So we'll call out actively with a reverse shell, and we'll listen locally, so the equivalent of our listening Netcat with a bind shell. So we'll listen for an incoming connection. So that would be 2 ways of making connections. Either we wait for someone to come to us, or we actively go to them. It's really just no 3 ways about it, just those 2. So this time we are going to actively call back. In particular, we're going to call back to this guy. So again, on the same system. So let's netcat to 192.168.1. What's my IP address? I forgot. 177. So netcat nc 192.168.1.77. So I'm really just talking to myself. And then I want port 1234. So netcat, IP address, and port. We don't get anything on this end, but if we come here, we did get a connection because I used that -v for verbose. That does tell us for the connection. So if I say, hi Georgia, over here with our connection, it comes back over here. Hello. So, a little chat program, if you will. Very primitive chat program. But certainly we can do better, right? Certainly we can do better. Alright, so let's do a Control-C to kill it. So once we kill one, the other one will close as well. Let's again open up our listener. So I can just do the up arrow to grab the last command I had. So again, I'm going to open up a listener. But this time, I'm going to do -E at the end for execute. I'm going to tell it I want to execute bin bash. So that's actually going to be our command interpreter. When I open up my terminal, what I'm dropping into is a bash shell. So that's the underlying thing that is taking our text and knowing what to do with it. It knows what chmod means, what ls means, what grep means. So what we're doing here is setting up a listener on port 1234, and then when someone connects, it's going to execute bin bash. So it's actually going to give someone a terminal. Awesome for remote administration, maybe not so awesome for security if we just have a root shell lying around. If we start this as root, whoever attaches to it will have root privileges. Whoever starts the program makes up what the privileges are, so whoever attaches to it will have root privileges, and thus will be able to destroy the file system, read all the files, including sensitive data, make changes. So, maybe not a good idea from a security perspective, but so it is. And again, on our other terminal, we can do the up arrow to connect. Again, our active connection. And let's see if we do an ls. See, it doesn't have a prompt. Sometimes it will give a prompt. It just depends on what kind of shell you're using. Like you can use different things besides netcat. Like some of the things in Metasploit will give you a prompt. Some things won't. It really just depends. So I can run commands here. So I can do an ls. And again, it's in the same directory as we are here. So we're still in home Georgia. So if we do an ls, it shows me the contents of Georgia's home directory. What if we cat out etc password? Passwd. Does anybody know what's an etc password? Well, usernames. Some more information about them. We have root. There aren't any passwords or password hashes here, so that's kind of unfortunate, right? But it has like information about, like, it uses bin bash, things like that, groups, user IDs, things like that. So here's Georgia and James down here, so home directories and what kind of shell they use, user IDs. But no password hashes, that's no good. But what about, since we have root privileges, what about etc shadow? What's in the shadow file? You guessed it. Password hashes. So if we can find password hashes on any of our targets in the shadow file for Linux systems, might be able to use a password cracker to reverse these. We know their password, but you know, it happens. So a bit more interesting when we actually have a program on the other end, such as the terminal. So again, we can do a Control-C. One more thing we can do is we can actually use netcat to send files. So if you're on network and you're trying to upload a file or download a file and you're not having any success with any other way of doing it, which is probably unlikely since Linux has wget. There's a few different ways to do it in Windows as well. We'll see that a bit later on when we do post-exploitation. I mean, moving files around is a rather interesting thing, but we could do netcat if we have it. So again, we could do our netcat listen, but this time let's do whatever comes in, let's output it into my file 3. And this time let's do, let me just create a file in the root directory called myfile4. This is a secret. And do an input, so we know that the greater than sign is output. We can do a less than sign for input to pipe it into our command. So I'll give it myfile4. That connects.